Charlotte Madison was Britain's first female fighter pilot, killing an untold number of people in Afghanistan from an Apache attack helicopter. She had served 3 tours there in Afghanistan. By the age of 26, she's told her story in a book called Dressed to Kill, which is a title managing to get the tone of the book girly and lethal at the same time, remarkably upbeat. The Hurt Locker, it ain't. She's left the army now, and she's married to an armed forces pilot. I asked her how Civvy Street is for her.
Brilliant. I have control over my life. It's really good.
You don't miss it at all?
I miss a lot of it, actually, and I miss a lot more than I thought I would, because when I left, I was just so excited. I was in Afghanistan almost up until the end of my serving time. I didn't fly when I got back, so all my last tour in Afghanistan, I was thinking, not only am I going to be a free woman, I'm not going to have to come back to Afghanistan. You know, there were all of these things that I was never going to have to do again, and I was so excited. And then, of course, when I left, I had forgotten that I would miss things like flying, that I miss, you know, all of the friends that I made and going to work every day and all the things that everyone always says they miss about, you know, a regular, nice environment like that. But I think the closeness that I had with everyone, I just didn't appreciate.
Let's talk about the Apaches, because they are apparently the hardest thing to learn to fly. Is that right?
Well, I think the course is certainly the longest out of the 3 helicopters that were on offer when I went through.
That's 3 years, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a good amount of time, yes, and that gets you from not knowing how to fly it at all until being ready to fly it in combat. So, you know, it only takes maybe 6 to 8 months to learn how to fly it safely around the United Kingdom, or, you know, something like that. But to learn to actually use all the systems, or, you know, use them integratedly, it does take a really long time.
Just as a matter of interest, what's the difference between the Army Air Corps, which you were in, and the RAF?
Well, we've got the 3 services, the same as you guys, the Navy, the Army, and the RAF. And the Army has lots of small departments like the engineers, the signals, the infantry, and the Army Air Corps is a small part of that. And it has a long history, which I won't bore you with, but it remains that we've got a small part of the Army that flies helicopters in order to support the troops on the ground more closely, whereas the RAF have the support helicopters that transport rations and troops, and then all the fast jets.
What proportion of your time then, flying in the Apaches, would have been spent escorting Chinook supply helicopters, for example, and what proportion would have been spent going out there in order to kill people specifically?
Probably on my first tour, we did about 1/3 of our time doing escorts. 1/3 of our time would then have been spent on deliberate missions. So the Marines are going into a compound, they need some overhead assistance. And then another third of our time would be spent on, you know, there's a big fight going on the ground. You need to go out now. There's already something kicking off and they need your help. But by the time my third tour came around, because we had so many more troops on the ground out in the forward operating bases, there was that much more requirement for rations, ammunition, water, and every time a Chinook goes out, an Apache needs to go with it. So I would say I would almost say more than half of the Apache hours by the time I left were in escorting.
When you go out and you have to kill people, how do you tell the difference between Taliban fighters, which are your targets, and innocent civilians?
That's such a good question, and I think that that's something that a lot of people really don't pick up on because they just assume that it's really easy, like in a video game. And it's one of the hardest things is when you go out to one of the missions, like I was saying, where there's already a fight kicking off, there's already something happening, the troops on the ground are already in trouble, so you feel a time pressure, and of course you appear on the scene, all of the Taliban put their weapons down and try to blend back in, and there's nothing you can do about it. And I've spent an hour and a half before talking to the troops on the ground who have the radios, and they've obviously got the description of who they want you to kill, and they're trying to describe him to you. They're saying he's walking east along such and such a street, he's wearing this, and you're trying to find him so hard, you're trying to pick him out from the crowd, and it is really, really difficult, and that is I think it's the most difficult thing, is telling friendly from enemy and telling enemy from innocent civilian, and it is just really hard. You just have to spend a lot of time overhead, you know, unless you're really lucky and you spot something actually happening, you know, Taliban with a gun, that's brilliant. But
do you think you ever made a mistake?
I honestly don't think I did, because I erred on the side of extreme caution. It's probably a little bit annoying sometimes for the troops on the ground, but they wanted help, and I would just say, "Oh, let me check." But I obviously talked about that, the part in my book where we destroyed a building and it turned out to have children in it, and that's a function of the way that the Taliban fight. I think if they're using a building, it's a valid military target. However, there's no accounting for what else is in the building, and mistakes do happen, and it is just one of the hardest things. But you've got to strike a balance between, we're there to do a job, we need to give the troops on the ground some of our assistance, and obviously trying to minimise all collateral damage and any civilian casualties.
It wasn't your Apache that ended up killing those children, but you saw it because the video is brought back, and after a mission, you analyse it for quite some time, don't you?
Yes, and everything that we do, every time we fire a weapon, we record. We record from the moment that we take off, really, just so that we can go back and have another look and talk about the radio calls that were made and why, build up the picture, basically. And every single gun tape is analysed with either the boss or one of the intelligence officers, things like that, just for learning points.
So what was the response of the guys, I presume it was men, who ended up being responsible for those children's deaths?
Well, they were absolutely gutted, and that's, we sat in the room for a long time afterwards, and all of us were saying, well, we would have done the same thing, we would have taken the same shot, going over the gun tape and saying, look, you didn't know, you saw the Taliban walking into the building, you'd been overhead for almost an hour, all of these things, trying to make them feel better, but, you can't make them feel better, but I think that the thing that they just needed to do was then put it out of their minds and know that they did their best and carry on trying to do their best.
When you said that you exercised extreme caution in order to be sure that the people you were shooting at were in fact Taliban, I'm just wondering whether that was difficult for you to do. You were, for at least 2 of your tours, I think, the only woman Apache pilot. Was there any pressure on you to be, I don't know, as gung-ho as the blokes?
In my first tour, because I was new, and there were only a couple of other new pilots, so hadn't been to Afghanistan before, newly trained, it was sort of a rite of passage to fire your first weapon for real. And all of the others, or the 2 others, did it within, a matter of weeks. And, of course, on valid targets, and it was all absolutely fine. And like I said, the gun tape gets watched. But it took me a month and a half, which is half of the length of the tour that I did, because it was only a 3-month tour. And there was definitely, not pressure, but banter from the boys about me being, I was just too peaceful as a female, and I didn't want to do anything. But I just didn't want to have to live with anything that I was going to regret. And by the time I did actually fire at real Taliban, I knew that they were real Taliban, and I came back and I was pleased with myself, as opposed to thinking, should I, shouldn't I?
I can completely understand why you are not a fan of the Taliban, that you call them very bad people. Do you think that you risk demonizing them in order to kill them?
I try not to think about it that deeply. I think that once you've joined the military, you do it for Queen and country and for your colleagues and all of the other reasons that people join up, and then it's really important not to question what you're being told to do, just to try and do it as best you can, because if you start thinking about it deeply, I think it gets you into all sorts of trouble. And I've seen people, refusing to go to Afghanistan, and it's not compatible, I don't think, with being in the military, having those sorts of views.
In other words, you join up and that's it.
Well, I think you have to, really, because otherwise, if you don't agree with the war that the government is sending you off to, what are you going to do? I mean, you can't go to Afghanistan and then not fire anything, or, you can't do the job half-heartedly, basically. So you've either got to be in it or you're not.
I don't know whether you really have an aunt or whether she's a sort of composite aunt to represent the anti-war faction in Britain, but
she's a genuine person. That actually happened.
Your aunt, on one of your leaves home, did one of those sort of dreadful dinner table conversational clangers and said, why should the taxpayers be paying for us to send little parcels over to you guys in Afghanistan? We don't want you there.
Yeah.
How often did you strike that attitude? It's not an uncommon one.
It's not, and a lot more often than I thought I would. I think because before I went to Afghanistan, I was always in training. It was never an interesting topic, so I never got into a discussion with anyone about wars because I hadn't been to one. And when I came back from the first tour, I was so changed, having seen what we're asking our young soldiers to do for all of our safety. And I came back and I thought that everyone would be on side. Everyone must know what's going on out there. Everyone would understand. And I came across that attitude all the time, or the attitude of the hairdresser, which I also describe that scene in my book, where she thought I'd been on holiday in Afghanistan because she had no idea there was anything even going on in Afghanistan. And, I just couldn't believe that people didn't understand. It's not about agreeing with the war for me, and this is a big part of why I wrote the book. I want people to understand that the soldiers have been asked to do this for all of us. Whether it's right or wrong is a totally different matter, but we've got to support the soldiers when they come back and while they're out there.
Did it occur to you ever that you might be making things worse in Afghanistan rather than making them better? Might be failing to win the hearts and minds of the people, which you point out as one of your missions?
We, the whole military, sure, certainly. But again, that goes back to me not questioning. Me as an individual, all you can do is, like I said before, just do what you're trained to do. And as far as hearts and minds, try not to destroy, somebody's crops if you don't need to, somebody's house if you don't need to. But I just can't get into questioning whether we're supposed to be there because it's just, it's so dangerous if you've got to go back again and again. If you start thinking that you shouldn't be there, it would just be a disaster.
So when you came back on leave and you heard very pessimistic reports from very authoritative sources about how it's not going well in Afghanistan and how it may be an unwinnable war, did you put your fingers in your ears and go, la, la, la?
Pretty much,
yeah.
And, I think there were rumours like that going around Camp Bastion, and I heard one of the young soldiers. I mean, they always look so young because they're all, they're just 18, and I saw them all queuing up for the cookhouse one day, and they were talking about whether we should be there, and they were unanimous, these soldiers, that we shouldn't be there. They didn't want to be there. We couldn't win, and it was just absolutely heartbreaking because they're genuinely risking their lives, and I think that's a phrase people use every day, but these soldiers really are, and they're living in the worst conditions, and obviously some of them don't think that we should be there, and it's just so sad, but it's not the soldiers' fault.
Could you have done another tour, or was that it for you anyway?
I could have done. If I'd stayed in, I certainly would have done another tour. And if I mentally hadn't wound down so much, I would have been ready for it, I'm sure. But for me, I'm glad that I only did 3. And
you only did 3. You got married. You wanted, presumably, a civvy life.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, my husband and I, he's serving as well. And
is he went to Afghanistan shortly after you got back, didn't he?
He goes away all the time to all sorts of different places, and the two of us have done so many tours since we've been together. One will be away and come back just, a week before the other goes away, something like that, and one of us really had to leave, and I decided that, I'd done what I wanted to do in the Army Air Corps and progressed as far as I wanted to progress, and so it was my turn to leave. It's
interesting you described the loneliness when you came back on leave. You just, the whole party scene and the chit-chat, and nobody understood what you'd been through. It's interesting to think, could you have married anyone that hadn't been through what you'd been through, didn't get what you did?
I certainly don't think we would be as close if we did, because I'm not very good at talking about, certainly Afghanistan. It was really difficult to know who to talk to and how much to say about it, so I tended to say nothing. And the fact that Jake, my husband, understood, has been out there, and, he's seen the job, there's just less talking that needs to go on, and he sort of understands what I'd been through. And I also wrote a diary with him in mind for the whole time I was out there. So when we got back, we didn't talk about anything. I just gave him this diary and then didn't discuss it again afterwards. And I think we're probably a lot closer for sharing a job.
When you got back from a mission, having killed people, what did you do?
Well, we had to go through the gun tapes. That's happens after every single mission.
Yeah.
But all I tended to want to do was go and do something completely different. I wanted to go and relax, take my mind off what I'd been doing, because you're so strung up after a mission.
So how did you do that?
Well, if there was another girl around, there was the female int officer, Louise, who I hung out with a lot, and we'd just go and have a chat or read magazines or go and find some tea somewhere, or, just sit down and try and be as girly as possible, as girly as you can if you're in a big military camp in your combat.
Her husband, Tom, was killed over there?
Yes, yeah.
That would have brought it all home.
That was definitely the low point of all of my tours, because I wasn't expecting it. I think you never expect somebody you know to be killed, and I knew he was out there, and I knew that we were attending a mission at his base, but it just never occurred to me that anything would happen to him. And then when it did, it was it was unbelievable, because it really made me realise even more the price of what we're doing out there. I mean, it's just shocking. And then, of course, every time anyone died after that, it was just more horrific.
I'm talking to Charlotte Madison, who was Britain's first female Apache pilot. Did flying an Apache make you somehow distanced from the carnage of war, as it were? Because you're up high there, and as far as I know, an Apache has never been brought down in Afghanistan. You're pretty strong.
Well, yes, statistically they keep telling us we're overdue a major incident, but you're right. So far we haven't been brought down, which is nice. I think you're remote in some ways. Obviously, distance-wise, you're some way away, and you're not actually in the you're not carrying a Bergen, carrying a radio, doing all these hideous physical tasks the soldiers have to do. But we do get, in some ways, more involved in the fighting, in that we've got 127 times zoom on our day site. We can see, the faces of the guys on the ground. You can see into house doors, and you can see right into people's back gardens. You really, really get a strong feeling of the pattern of life on the ground, and if something has changed, and so in that way I think we get even more involved, because you're sort of really into the heart of the life in the village, or the lack of it.
To get that involved, how low do you have to be to the ground?
We try and keep, we don't go low unless we absolutely need to.
So how low can you go? I'm just wondering why an Apache has never been brought down. Are you too high up?
We do try and stay as higher, so that we're out of the threat band, but you just never know, do you? It depends what weapons the Taliban are using on the day.
The reason I asked about what you did when you got back from a mission is I wondered if blokes de-stressed differently.
Well, I think they all de-stressed by just reliving the mission again and again and again, and then they would go and play Call of Duty 4 on their computers, which is one of those shoot-'em-up type games.
Oh, Lord, did they?
To live and breathe it. Yeah, it was incredible. I mean, I really noticed that difference, and I know it wasn't just me being different. It's definitely girls and boys, because, again, the female int officer, she didn't want to talk about all of the missions that she debriefed, and she watches all the gun tape. Her job is quite difficult. She also wanted to do something totally different when we finished for the day.
But that gender difference, if you like, the sort of gender cultural difference, didn't affect how you did your job?
Well, I was really worried that it would, of course, because I didn't know. I didn't have anyone to look up to and base my experiences that would come on. And I don't think it did, but a lot of that is because I was so lucky with my squadron. They totally accepted me from the very start. And when we got to the Jugram Fort rescue, which was, it was only a couple of weeks after I'd fired my first real shots, I realised that they completely trusted me. I was detailed off to do an important job, and nobody said, "Oh, are you going to be okay, or do you think we should send a different call sign to go and do it?" I was just sent off, trusted to do my part, and then when we came back, nobody particularly said, "Wow, you did okay." We just went through our debrief, and it was accepted that everyone could do their part, and that was amazing for me.
The rescue you're referring to is the rescue of Lance Corporal Matthew Ford from a Taliban fort.
That's right, yeah. They found his body. He went missing in the withdrawal. They found the body. They didn't know whether he was alive or not, and the quickest way to go and get him was to send 2 Apaches across with some volunteers from his squadron on, pick him up and bring him back across. And my 2 Apaches were going to be the protection, basically. So I was the decoy, basically.
And how nerve-wracking was that?
It was nerve-wracking afterwards. At the time, I didn't really think about it. Maybe that's just stupidity, my tiny brain. But at the time, I just thought, okay, let's get the job done. Don't use up all your ammunition too soon, keeping half an eye on the helicopters that were on the ground. And then after they'd gone and we all got back to base and we were all sitting and talking about it, as the boys like to do, I did think that was a little bit close and a little bit dangerous, and then I was really frightened.
One would have to point out that it turned out that he wasn't alive in the end.
He wasn't, which was absolutely devastating, but at least we got the body back, because I think we all know what happens to British soldiers' bodies.
Yeah. The conditions were hard. You talk about exhaustion, you talk about dirt, you talk about lack of personal space. And yet you also seem to be determined to stress your femininity throughout. Is that a kind of a reverse psychology thing? Not a reverse psychology.
It had anything particularly to do with the conditions. It was just that I had never embraced my girliness before. I was never a particularly girly girl. I mean, like a lot of girls, I was a tomboy, and, you know, I liked to run around and get dirty when I was little. And it wasn't really until I joined the army that I realised that being a girl was actually something to be proud of, and it was really special. So, you know, I'd get a pink fluffy pen sent to me in the mail, and I'd made sure that I actually used it in a brief or something. And, you know, people would say, "Oh, that's so girly," and I would say, "Well, I'm a girl, I'm allowed." And I really tried to hang on to those things and, you know, use a pink hairband if I could. Just, you know, little tiny things, nothing ridiculous. And it did make me feel more like me, and it just sort of reminded me that I didn't have to turn into a robot, you know, because all of the men pick up mannerisms. They all sit with their legs splayed and, you know, swear lots, and, you know, you don't have to be like that. And I just tried really hard to keep myself girly.
Did the army offer you any counselling when you finished?
They had one session, and when we were leaving our third tour, and a sort of counselling nurse came to speak to us, and he went through a little bit of our gun tape, and just, it was pretty disappointing. And he basically said, if you have any problems, the support is here, please come and talk to us. But I don't count that as counselling, and I think we should have had a lot more. And I know that some of the infantry units do have a little bit more. They have a sort of almost a traffic light system. They'll sit down individually with each soldier, and they'll ask them questions like, have you shot at anyone? Have you been shot at? You know, really simple questions. And then they'll grade them red light for definitely needs counselling, amber, you know, etc. And I think we should maybe have something more like that, or, you know, just somebody that knows what can trigger post-traumatic stress should watch through the gun tape and come and talk to us individually and say, you might have problems with this, the way to deal with it is this. But I think we're always learning, aren't we? So hopefully the army will improve.
I mean, I know that you've seen others go under with post-traumatic stress. Did you evidence any of it?
What, in myself?
Yeah.
I don't think so, and I think writing the book has probably been a big part of that, because it's been very cathartic and it's been very useful to sort of edit my memories for me. And I think that, well, a lot of people with post-traumatic stress aren't sure what's causing them to be so anxious. You know, they don't know what event has triggered it. They're just, you know, they just get so confused, and they're searching for a reason, and it is just really difficult for them. Whereas for me, because I've got the book now, I know exactly which events have upset me and why, because I had to put it all down on paper. So that it's been really, really therapeutic in that way.
Any problems with the Ministry of Defence with the book? I mean, they vetted it, obviously, and your face is obscured and some names have been changed, including your own. But did they want you to change anything more substantive than that?
Not really. They were really, really pleased about the book throughout, and they have been really, really supportive. And, you know, they were worried about some of the names. They wanted to contact Matthew Ford's family and make sure that they were happy, and small things like that. But they've been really supportive, because I think they know that the message needs to get out there, because the soldiers aren't getting the support that they need when they come home.
So the Ministry of Defence, not to put too fine a point on it, sees it as a PR exercise, apart from anything else, does it, do you think?
I think so, yes, I think so. But, you know, and I originally thought, oh, that's so foolish of them, they just think it's good PR. But actually now, seeing the military as a civilian, I think the military does need a PR, some sort of dedicated PR, because, you know, I've just experienced so much hatred for the military and for the soldiers, and we could do with some good PR, really.
What will you do now? What are you doing now? You'll keep flying, civilian flying?
Yeah, so you have to. It's quite a big transition. So I've been studying for my civilian pilot's licenses, and there are a lot of helicopter jobs that you can get. I'll definitely stay in helicopters. So when I finish my licenses, I can start looking for something like that. Apart
from not killing people anymore, why is it different?
I think it'll be less adrenaline, and I think I'll probably...
No, but I mean, I would have thought that, you know, you can fly an Apache, you can fly anything, right?
There are things that you're not doing in an Apache that are really important in quite a lot of jobs. And, you know, like the Chinooks out in theatre are taking off and landing, and they're landing in very difficult sites. They're landing in small sites, they're landing in dusty sites. And if I were to do something like the air ambulance, which is quite big over in the UK, I would need to be landing in quite bizarre sites all of the time. And that's something that, as an Apache pilot, I'm not that good at, and I would definitely have to work on that. So I think there are pluses and negatives, definitely.
Would you recommend doing what you did to other women?
I think that would depend on the woman, and I would definitely want to chat to her first. But I definitely think women can take over the world, and I think we can do it one helicopter at a time. So I definitely say that women should join the military, because I think there's a lot of things that we're actually better at than the boys. But you've got to be fairly strong-willed and self-sufficient to join up as well.
What are you better at than the boys?
I think things like, it's very typical to say it, but the multitasking. And in the helicopter, one of the things that people in general, boys and girls, find more difficult is doing so many things at once. So flying the helicopter isn't the hard bit, which is what people think. It's flying the helicopter whilst reading the map, whilst using the radios, whilst sorting out the radar or the weapon system, something like that, and being able to switch between those tasks. And or the female pilots that I've spoken to, because I know quite a few, maybe not Apache pilots, have all found that side of things much, much easier. None of them have struggled on that, whereas the boys sometimes do, because they just get a bit tunnel-visioned about things.
You make no bones about the fact that the Army, as if one didn't know, is a very sexist organisation. And you do cite certain examples. Most of them you take in good heart. Did any of them really upset you?
Only I think, I go quite heavily into all the staring that happened.
The staring? I mean, that would drive you mad on a daily basis, the staring.
Well, it was it was really difficult. At first I thought, oh, okay, they're staring, that's okay, I'll just deal with it. And I tried to think, well, if there was a camp full of women and we hadn't seen a man for 6 months and a man walked in, we would probably stare. But I think as a girl, you're just naturally more paranoid. You're always convinced you've got loo paper stuck to your shoe and, things like that. I think girls are just always paranoid. So every day I would think, oh, maybe I haven't zipped my flies, maybe I've forgotten to put my T-shirt on, just checking. And it does make you a bit of a psycho with, just such paranoia. And then, as I became more tired and generally fatigued and stressed, I just thought it's so unfair. Why are they making my life more difficult? I only want to help them. Of course, all the Apache pilots only want to help the soldiers. And then here's the soldiers making my life really difficult. And I did find that really hard. But you do expect some sexism when you join the military. So, I tried to take it with a pinch of salt, but it was really difficult.
And now, back in civilian life, do you ever encounter people to whom you want to say, this is what I did, this is what I can do, don't treat me like somebody's wife?
Yes, all the time. And I try not to say anything like that because I know how it sounds, and I've seen people that have left the military before telling everyone ad nauseum what they used to do, so I try and keep my mouth shut. But yeah, I had to go get a headlight changed on my car just the other day, and they were trying to overcharge me, and they were trying to tell me how difficult it was to change a headlamp. It's sort of very dangerous gas, and I didn't understand, and I did want to throttle him, but I just said, okay, I'm just going to go and check the price with somebody, thanks. Oh.
Do you dream about it? Do you dream about Afghanistan?
Yes, I do, and certainly writing the book, because I was, reliving the experiences for the book. I dreamt about it all of the time, and not necessarily actual events. I would just dream that I was back there, but not wearing any clothes. The usual anxiety dreams. I have a lot of those about Afghanistan.
And do you worry constantly about your husband?
When he's away, yes, I worry every minute, of course.
Will he always do that?
I think he'll do it for at least a long time. I know, he's not done yet. I would never make him leave because it's such a big part of him. But it's much, much worse being the one who's away. And it was so funny because when we first got together, he was the first one to go away, and he went and did a tour of Bosnia, and he was away for 5 months, and it was the worst 5 months of my life. And he came back, and I said, I've had the worst 5 months. It's been so stressful. I've been so worried. I've been holding the phone with me 24 hours a day. And he said, I'm the one that's been away. It's been much worse for me. I've been in the war. And I said, oh, okay. And then when I went away and got back, he said, you're right, hands down, it's so much worse being the one being at home because you worry the whole time. Whereas, when I was out in Camp Bastion, I know when I'm safe in my bed. I know when I'm just drinking a cup of tea and no one needs to worry. But he'll be at home worrying the whole time. And
can you deal with that worry for the foreseeable future for him?
Well, I'll have to. Yes, and I will. And I'm getting better at dealing with it. And I live on the military area, so there's plenty of other wives whose husbands will be away, and that's nice to have that support as well. So, yes, I'll just deal with it.
It's Charlotte Madison. His book's called Dressed to Kill.